Richie Allen.
Let's welcome my next guest to the programme. I'm extremely fond of her. She's a remarkable woman, a remarkable human being. As I mentioned at the top of the programme, she's a former intelligence officer for MI5. Remember her resigning back in 1996 to blow the whistle on serious corruption within the organisation. The book Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers is magnificent. I recommend you read it if you can get it in your library. If not, get onto Amazon and get a copy of it, or another good online retailer. She now writes, of course, talks publicly around the world, and I was reading today, she sent me it has to be said, I would have come across it anyway, an op-ed piece by her or on RT.com. Before we get into that though, let's welcome her to the programme. Annie Machon, welcome to this show. How are you?
Hi Richie, I'm good. How are you?
I'm delighted. I'm thrilled to have you back on it. Well, but say back on, we've just been doing this show a few weeks. The last time we spoke was on TV in London. So it's great. You know how fond I am of you, Annie. You're an amazing woman. I just said that. So we'll leave the mutual appreciation to one side for the moment, because there's so much stuff to talk about. You were in God's country only a week or so ago. You're in Ireland talking about these issues. Before we get to your piece in RT, are my people beginning to get up off their knees, Annie, and make their voices heard?
Well, I hope so. I mean, they've done a pretty good job of it over the years anyway. But no, I spoke at the Web Summit last week in Dublin. And it was an amazingly big event. It seems to be the biggest sort of tech-type event in Europe at the moment now. There are over 22,000 people there. And it seemed to reflect a growing vibrancy of tech startups and companies in Dublin. But also, I think, a growing interest in some of the sort of security and anti-surveillance issues, which is what I was there to talk about on one of the Guardian panels in this sort of post-Snowden world. So it was very interesting, and the response, to people talking about these issues was amazing. So it was great.
Brilliant stuff. I want to talk about your article just a little bit now. Reading your article, it made me think, and it's a great article, I say that again, I'm going to link to it on our Facebook page now. There's a really serious, almost Armageddon-type battle being fought in cyberspace right now, and people like me, we're not aware of that. Is that fair to say?
I think so, yes. I mean, I've been sort of knocking around hacktivist circles now for a number of years, and it's been fascinating for me because ever since I was involved with the spies in the 90s and then whistleblowing and knowing what it's like to live under surveillance, I've been particularly paranoid, of course, about any electronic communications I might have been able to have, knowing the capabilities and knowing the future possible capabilities they might be developing on the back of the tech boom, the internet growth from the 1990s. So I've been very aware of those issues for a long time. I've been increasingly aware, knocking around in tech circles, of quite what might be possible. And I think actually looking at what Snowden has disclosed has sort of confirmed all our deepest concerns about what might be possible, and then some as well. So this is very much an ongoing battle. This is something that's been talked about as well since the 1980s with the Open Software Foundation, where people like Richard Stallman, people like Professor Ava Moblin have been saying, if we cannot protect our privacies over the internet, then basically we've lost our democracy, because we will start to self-censor, we will start to worry about what might be being collected from what we say and what we write and what we watch and what we read. And that thereby we will self-censor, thereby we will not organise, we will not take action if we see our governments pushing back against us and becoming totalitarian, which of course is the way that Germany slid into Nazism in the 30s and the sort of the culture that imposed the hegemony of the Stasi in East Germany. So I think it's sort of a very big, very private battle that's been going on the internet, across the internet, in cyberspace. And it's thanks to Edward Snowden that many, many more of us are now thinking about these issues much more deeply.
Yeah, too right it is. I spoke with Stephen Lendeman on the programme last night. Now, he's outlined in a new book, Annie, that he's edited, really, and contributed to, about Ukraine and what's happened there. That the United States is essentially, he believes, pushing us to the brink of a third world war because of its meddling in the affairs of Ukraine and Russia. I said to him last night that, some of our listeners would be terrified to hear that. And I wasn't scolding him in any way, shape or form, but many of our listeners remember the 70s and 80s when they were terrified, because you had liars like Donald Rumsfeld in 1976 talking about the Soviet Union being busy, making up horror stories. And that scares people. And I'm not sure I believe that we'll ever get to, a nuclear war, a crazy third world war that leaves us all in peril. Do you think he's onto something? Is he right? He says it's very possible. How do you feel about it?
Well, I would hope not, I think is the easy answer. But the flagrant meddling by the US and its proxy, of course, the EU, within Ukraine, has been very damaging to East-West relations. And this is something I was addressing in the article I wrote 2 days ago. And this came about really because I've had the privilege of working with a lovely man called Ray McGovern, former senior CIA officer. He used to be the person who went in and gave the daily security briefing to the president throughout the late 80s. And he's a Soviet expert. So he speaks fluent Russian, all the rest of it. He's now also out there and proud as a peace activist. So he's an amazing guy. And he was over in Europe a couple of months ago doing a series of talks and interviews. And I heard a lot of what he was saying. And his view was very much looking back at what happened when the Berlin Wall came down 25 years ago. And the deal that was done between the then president, George H.W. Bush, and the then Soviet General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev. And America wanted German reunification. That scared the pants off Russia, especially after their experiences in the Second World War, where 25 million of them were killed by the Nazis. But the quid pro quo, as far as Russia was concerned, was that if German reunification happened, and US basically said it was inevitable, then the quid pro quo would be that it would have to be part of NATO, the unified Germany. But NATO would not move 1 inch further east from there. Now, of course, we've seen over the last 25 years quite how much further NATO has expanded into the east. It's got another 12 countries, including Poland, which is now full of, is bristling with US defensive missiles, the Baltic states. And now, of course, we see the possibility of Ukraine and Georgia being incorporated into NATO too. And this was something that was made in a declaration by the NATO committee in 2008. And so I can understand why Russia is getting very twitchy, very concerned about how close NATO is getting right into its local yard, its local backyard. And, of course, the US has reneged on its deal. I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is Russia acting in a very sort of responsible and, statesmanlike manner in the face of gross provocation. It did not get involved in the Libya fiasco. It brokered a more sort of thoughtful approach to how to deal with the Syrian problem. You remember there were all these stories about Assad's been using chemical weapons against his population. Then it turned out it looked like actually it was the rebels who'd done that.
Yeah.
And now, of course, the situation in Ukraine. Russia is not invading Ukraine. It's not sending huge amounts of armaments and weapons and army people across into Ukraine. It is taking a very sensible and very measured approach. And the contrast, I think, to any thinking person between that and the sort of aggression of America rampaging across the Middle East and meddling and subverting the Ukraine is quite stark. So who exactly is the peacemaker here?
Yeah, and I want to just say Annie's article is brilliant, and there's a lovely, I say lovely, but it's a really graphic, for want of a better word, a graphic illustration there of just what NATO looked like in 1990, as Annie just described there, and what it looked like a few years ago in 2009. And it is startling. And it's got to be said, and you do mention it in the article, you're not an apologist for Russia, let alone anybody. But it is fair to say that their, restraint is absolutely remarkable in the face of what is unbelievable provocation. And it has to be said as well, there are people in Ukraine, of course, who, the people we're being told are rebels. And people that we're being told are being egged on by Moscow. But these are people who would have, their ties would be to Russia. And these people feel they're not going to be represented by this current government, which of course has been put in place because the previously democratically elected government was overthrown. And you're not getting that on the mainstream news in the evening. But this is all fact.
I know. I mean, there's plenty of information out there if you want to dig. And on many foreign mainstream news websites, it just seems to be the US and the UK media particularly is bad. It's sort of pushing this lie about what Russia is, what its intentions are, as if it's some expansionist imperialist power. Whereas in fact what they're just trying to do is protect the integrity of their own borders, their own sphere of influence. The expansionist imperialist power surely is the opposite direction. I mean, we've seen this time and time again over the last decade across the Middle East with what America's doing. So it's very much a sort of pot calling the kettle black. And I think for the people in East Ukraine and also Crimea, it must have been very frightening when their democratically elected government was overthrown by a ragtag group of political opportunists, many of whom had been backed and funded by the US and by the EU to the tune of $5 billion, I believe, over the last few years. And some of them are very extreme right-wingers. And they were saying very early on, as soon as they seized power, that they were going to outlaw the use of Russian as an official language within Ukraine. Now, you've got great swathes of the East, and the whole of Crimea is pretty much ethnic Russian. For them to hear something like that must have been very frightening. You know, they'd remember the sort of the purges, you know, from years ago under the Soviet Union or whatever. So of course they'd be frightened. Of course they'd push back. Of course there would be unrest. And then you see this sort of wholesale bombing of towns in the East. And that's going to feel like they're being attacked. They're at war.
Absolutely right. And you're talking to an Irishman who knows his history and knows when it was when it was outlawed to speak the Irish language in my country, when it was outlawed to say mass, if the mass was being held. First of all, it was outlawed to say mass, but if you were saying it in the Irish language, you could be killed for it. And of course, that's absolutely terrifying. Loads of tweets coming in with loads of questions. You mentioned in the article about Gorbachev saying, of course, recently that we are facing a new Cold War. In light of how dangerous the situation is, maybe a Cold War, maybe we'll accept that so long as people are not lobbing bombs at one another. Here's a good question coming in from a listener asking, how would any Cold War differ from the Cold War that we grew up learning about and reading about all the time in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s? How would it differ? I suppose we're back again now to cyberspace.
Well, partly, yes, that is definitely a new front line. There's no doubt about it. But again, the aggressor seems to be the US with the NSA surveillance, the sort of global panopticon they've been building, with the say-so of...
With the help of the Germans.
Yes, very much so. And of course, GCHQ has been prostituting itself to the NSA to the tune of over $100 million, over the last few years, to put the priorities of the NSA above the priorities of what GCHQ should be doing, which is protecting national security, whatever that is, in the UK. So that's certainly one new front line. The second front line, of course, is the geographical new front line with the spread of NATO. There's no doubt about it. But I think in terms of the difference, one, the old Cold War had this idea of mutually assured destruction acting as a sort of balance that would assure that nobody let off the first nuke. Now what we're seeing, certainly from some of the neocon hawks in America, is the possibility of putting missiles in Poland. You know, they've edged very close to the border of Russia, of perhaps having missile ships based in the Black Sea. This is partly why the US wanted the Ukraine to hold on to Crimea, so that Russia lost its naval base. It can put at the disposal of the US. So then the MAD concept, mutually assured destruction, is not necessarily guaranteed. America could let off a first strike much more quickly and deal with Russia before it would have the chance to hit back. So that MAD idea, and it is mad, wouldn't act as a balance of power anymore. So that's one problem. In terms of what it would mean for Europe, though, I think we would be very much stuck as piggy in the middle between the US and Russia and other Russian allies, particularly China. So Europe is incredibly dependent energy-wise on Russian energy sources. Europe is very dependent for exports to Russia. It's very dependent for a lot of banking. And if Russia suddenly pulls away from Europe because it sees Europe as just purely an American satellite, we are going to suffer. I mean, our economies are in enough trouble as it is. If Russia bails on us as well, we are absolutely screwed. So the quality of life for Europe, even financially and economically, would be much worse. Then, of course, if skirmishes start to break out or whatever, then we're going to be very much the battleground.
Of course, yeah, right in the middle of it.
So it's a mess every which way you look at it.
You know, and I love to mention in the article of the Emmanuel Goldstein figure, which of course our government here in Britain and the government in the United States keeps returning to time and time again. And I don't want to insult the listeners, but just in case you haven't read George Orwell, this is the big bad wolf, the invisible enemy that we should be constantly in fear of, who's trying to kill us all the time. We read The Boy Who Cried Wolf when we were children, Annie. Why do you think, this is the $64 million question, why do you think ordinary men and women like me are still buying into this garbage? That boogeymen around the corner that we can't see are doing everything they can to bring death and destruction into our lives when it's just nonsense.
Absolutely. I think mainly, I would place the blame mainly at the feet of the mainstream media, who are not the fourth estate anymore. They're not holding power to account or telling truth to power. They are peddling the propaganda lies of what our political classes and the global elite want us to believe. So for a long time, of course, Al-Qaeda was the great bogeyman. Now we got rid of bin Laden, and strangely, suddenly his alleged murderer is now out and proud. And then they were talking about ISIS. And ISIS is an interesting case because, again, this is something I mentioned in that article. If you look at what's going on in Syria, geopolitically, America wants to oust Assad. We've known that. He's been part of the axis of evilitude, or whatever George Bush called it, for years. But the key reason why they want to do that is because Iran, a client state of Russia, had struck a deal to run a pipeline to take its energy via Iraq and Syria into Europe. So thereby providing a huge amount of energy for Europe. And of course, it's a Russian client state, so that would work every which way, and it would help Iran bust the sanctions, which are illegally in place against it. However, the competing interest is that Qatar and Saudi Arabia also want to build a pipeline to put their energy into Europe, which the Americans want, because that means that their energy continues to be traded in dollars, which is the world's reserve currency. So you have a situation where it's good for America's client states, Saudi and Qatar, and also it again breaks away the European dependency on Russian energy and breaks that working relationship. So we have a situation where Saudi and Qatar are sort of competing for who they want to replace Assad with. Now, Qatar seems to be backing the Muslim Brotherhood, which America always calls the more moderate Islamists. And Saudi, of course, is backing very much the more extreme elements, including ISIS. So for a while, it looked like ISIS was being touted as the new Emmanuel Goldstein. But suddenly it's not. Suddenly the heat's shifted onto Russia again. It's weird. It's very interesting to sort of try and tease all this out.
Yeah, and it changes. I mean, it not to be at all crass about it or in any way, trying to take away from the seriousness of it, but it does play out sometimes like a ridiculous crime serial on TV with ridiculous twists and plots and backstabbings and who's doing what. But I mean, the petrodollar thing. I mean, you go into that with Libya and Saddam Hussein's attempts to maybe sell oil in euro, and then the coincidence of what happened to both of them, Annie.
Well, absolutely. I mean, certainly in 2003, Iraq was under very stringent sanctions, if you remember, but it could trade oil for food. And it began to try and trade that oil in euros rather than dollars. And immediately, it gets slammed and Saddam Hussein is deposed. The same with Libya. Even despite the fact that Colonel Gaddafi came in from the cold, there was that deal in the desert with Tony Blair, and he gave up his alleged weapons of mass destruction. It was all hunky-dory, even to the point where MI6 was handing on a plate so-called dissidents like Abdel Hakim Belhaj to Colonel Gaddafi as a present to show their good faith. Even despite all this, as soon as Gaddafi started talking about establishing what he called an African dinar currency, backed by the Libyan oil wealth, suddenly again he was deposed, because that would have been huge. I mean, it would have given massive increased stability to the whole African region, which was one of the aims he was trying, sort of Pan-African Confederation. So he got deposed. Again, Iran, they were going to be invaded in 2008. George Bush has admitted that in his memoirs. And Iran was beginning to sell its energy reserves in euros as well, through its oil bourse. So this happens time and time and time again. Even Russia sells some of its energy in rubles rather than in the dollar. So if you take away that dollar monopoly, then you just expose to the world that America is actually bankrupt. It's just mired in debt. And that's its only guarantee of continuing solvency. So it's fighting for its very financial survival by blocking any challenge to its petrodollar monopoly.
Annie, stay with us for another 10 minutes. I know it's a bit later there in Germany, but we won't keep you too much longer. I want to take a very quick break. It's great having you back on. It might be in the new year before we chat again. It probably will be. It'll be into the new year. So stay with us if you don't mind. Annie will stay with us for another 10 minutes. I'm going to take a very quick break then. When we come back to some tweets that I'll put to Annie, and we'll get through another couple of questions then. It's 27 minutes to the top of the hour. This is the Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com and syndicated, of course, on Talk Radio Europe and Fab Radio International. 30,000 people verifiable tuning in live to the programme every night, not counting, of course, those who catch the repeats, and the nearly 100,000 people who've listened back to one of these interviews on our YouTube channel. Pretty proud of that. Back in a minute.
For critical information ignored by the mainstream media, log on to davidike.com/headlines now.
At Holland Hydroponics, you'll find a wide variety of hydroponic systems, accessories, plant nutrition, and the latest hydroponic innovations, always in stock. Visit www.hydroponics.co.uk in May to find these fantastic offers. Holland Hydroponics, open in Manchester, Burnley, Huddersfield, and our new store in Flint, North Wales.
Sasmi Books is a friendly family self-publishing company set up to help authors and potential authors like you to get your book into print.
At Sasmic, we offer self-publishing packages that get your manuscript published. We also offer other services that include book cover and layout design, website design, marketing materials, video production, and other services.
Here at Sasmi Books, we give every project the personal touch, whilst offering competitive prices and delivering a quality service and product you can be proud of. So why not join us at www.sasmibooks.com to see what we can do for you.
Welcome back to the show. 25 minutes to the top of the hour. This is the Richie Allen Show in association with davidicke.com. Annie Machon, thank you for sticking around. It's great to have you on. It's brilliant. I had an email from James O'Brien earlier on. He's just emailed me to ask you about Iran and the quietness around Iran. Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu was in New York a couple of weeks back, and when everybody else was talking about Syria and Ukraine, he was jumping up and down saying, I'm over here. Iran are crazy. They're dangerously crazy people. Is there a worry, James is asking, that the Israelis might still do something stupid and preemptively attack Tehran? Or will they just continue killing scientists surreptitiously, covertly murdering scientists? Or should we worry about the possibility that there'll be a serious strike on Tehran?
I would hope not. I think that probably would be the line that America would not want Israel to cross. We know, as I mentioned earlier, from George Bush's memoirs, that they were all set to attack Iran in 2008. And the only reason that they were stopped from doing it was because of the work of an intelligence official called Dr. Thomas Finger, who displayed great integrity. And in fact, he won the Sam Adams Award for Integrity and Intelligence 2 years ago for this work. And he was the one who collated the National Intelligence Estimate of 2007, a very famous one, which is the combined thinking of all 16 of America's intelligence agencies and their view on Iran, and was Iran still trying to develop a nuclear weapons capability. And the combined thinking of all 16 intelligence agencies was they had ceased to try and do that in 2003. There was therefore no justification to attack Iran. And this intelligence estimate has been re-ratified every year since, and this is why the American establishment cannot take action and why the American establishment is trying to rein Israel in from anything overt. However, of course, if you look at some of the more covert and new frontline issues, Israel and America have been involved in the very first overt form of cyber warfare, which was the release of the Stuxnet internet virus, which was designed specifically to target the nuclear power stations in Iran. Now, this worked. It caused all sorts of damage to these nuclear power stations with very little thought to actually what might happen if these power stations were damaged. And it also, an unforeseen consequence was that this virus is now being released into the wild of the internet. So it's just out there. It can be mutated. It is mutating, and it can attack anything now. And it's in the hands of those who might want to harm us as well. So, conceivably, it could be used and developed and mutated to attack the infrastructure of Western countries and things, as well as other countries. So it was a very reckless act of warfare, of a war crime, I suppose, in attacking the infrastructure of another country.
I want to talk a little bit about the media again. You brought up the media. You do some work with RT, which, to their credit, I have to say, and I'm not just saying it because you're on, they're inclined to put out stories and put out voices, people whom wouldn't ordinarily get a look in. I mean, as intelligent as you are, and I'm not buttering you up at all, Annie, I mean, you're an extraordinarily intelligent person. I mean, you are. I mean, you didn't work for the security forces because you're an idiot. You're incredibly...
Oh, some people do.
Well, some people did, yeah. I mean, you're incredibly eloquent, immensely well-read woman. you're not going to be invited on to Newsnight to talk about these issues, which is, is a disgrace in itself. But RT are out there doing what they're doing, and others are doing what they're doing as well. In a small way, shows like this. In a bigger way, maybe shows like Alex and the InfoWars crew are getting stuff out there. Do you think there's going to come a point? I'm asking you this question. A few weeks back, Richard Gage got on to, what was it? Which one was it? C-SPAN. And Richard was able to talk about why the architects don't believe the buildings came down the way we were told the buildings came down. I thought that was it was a lovely thing. And I asked Richard about it. I said, Richard, why do you think you were given 35 minutes, largely uncontested now, amazingly enough, by C-SPAN? And Richard said this. He said, because we're kind of far away now from 9/11. I didn't think we were, but he said we are. We're 13, 14, whatever it is years now, 13 years away from it. And what you have now, he said, is a generation of young men and women in newsrooms around the world. Okay, 85% or 90% of them might be the rip and read people who will just rip what comes off of the wires and read it out verbatim as if it's true. But he said there are men and women, and he said more than you think, in these newsrooms who are not like that. And who are interested in stories, want to hear, Annie Machon, what an interesting woman, must get in touch with her, want to speak to Richard Gage. Is there hope that even outside the alternative media, that in the mainstream media, there are people working in there that want to do the right thing? What do you think?
Absolutely, yes. And in fact, RT plays a very strong part in that, because it does give a voice to people who might be a bit more contentious. But it is very watched by a lot of the younger journalists, particularly working in the mainstream media. So in fact, I do get a lot of interviews onto, the BBC, Channel 4 News sometimes, lots of BBC radio, other radio mainstream outlets. And there was mention in The Observer recently. So there is an awareness out there. And by writing on my website, anniemachon.ch, by the way, and also doing interviews for places like RT, you do get the coverage. And often I think it goes in waves. So after a year or so, you get a few bites at the cherry. And then someone from on high probably says to the youngsters, oh, you can't use her, she's too contentious. And then that tribal knowledge shifts as people move on, and you get another wave of youngsters, and they invite you back on. And it's great fun. So that there is coverage, but it is difficult. But I think I absolutely agree. There is a new generation, the digital natives, are now coming into our mainstream media, and they're aware of many, many other issues, rather than just the sort of corporate propaganda that is spewed out daily by it.
Now, I don't want to skirt over this. I'm not going to keep you too much longer, because we have an agreement we'll only do a half an hour. But I want to ask you, we mentioned it on the show last night, and we're probably going to get into it again tomorrow night, this transatlantic trade and investment partnership. And the scare stories coming out of the negotiations around this particular trade agreement about the implications for privacy, the implications for freedom of the press, and of course, the horrible possibility that corporations will be able to take on governments, because if they don't like what governments are doing and maybe impacting on their business. I think when we spoke in London months ago, you and I think we did touch on this. This is something that people need to be aware of, this agreement, isn't it?
Hugely, yes. I don't know how many of your listeners might remember ACTA, the anti-copyright trade agreement, that was squashed a couple of years ago because of mass demonstrations across Europe. People were so angry about this, which was trying to just stop sort of piracy, copyright and all that sort of thing. TTIP is like a zombie ACTA. You keep knocking it down and this bloody idea keeps coming back. So the really invidious thing about TTIP, from my perspective, is that it's being imposed on the EU, and the European Parliament most of the people in it are not even allowed to read or know what's going on in the negotiations or read what is actually in the treaty. They are just being ordered to sign it. So this is utterly undemocratic. Then you have a situation where, as you said, it protects not only copyright but also patents and things like that. So, for example, if Monsanto has a patented GM food that it wants to grow in France, and France democratically represented by its government says our people do not want GM food in France, Monsanto can then sue the French government for potential loss of earnings in the future because they're not allowed to sell and grow that GM crop in France. So this means that global corporations suddenly have hegemony over our national governments, and democracy is dead. So this is a very important act to oppose, and to make ourselves very vocal about the fact we don't want this stuff imposed by the global corporate elite. We want a functioning democracy to remain. And, to give them credit, a lot of the EU MEPs are pretty angry about the fact they're not even allowed to know the terms of this agreement before they're forced to sign and agree to it. So I can't think of anything worse. Mussolini's definition of fascism was the merger of the corporate and the state. Now, I can't think of anything more clear about that definition than what TTIP represents. So we all need to make sure that we have our voices heard about it.
Too right. Just finally, and this is not to be at all negative now, but have you stopped looking under the car, and have you stopped looking over your shoulder all these years later? Do you think that MI5, because to be fair to you, I mean, it took some courage to do what you and David Shaler did. It really did. And I don't say that lightly. Absolutely huge courage to stand up to that. But of course, it was scary for you in the early days. Do you think we're way beyond that now? I hope we are. I'm not saying that in jest now. I mean that.
I would hope, but unfortunately I don't think that's the case. What they did when they were investigating us in the late 1990s, because we blew the whistle and went on the run around Europe, and Dave went to prison twice and lots of us got arrested, what they did then was very resource intensive because it was the analogue era. Now, of course, they can do exactly that sort of in-depth investigation at the flick of a switch, and we are all living under that degree of surveillance now. This is what Snowden has exposed. So, yes, I do still look over my shoulder. I am still concerned about my internet privacy, and I take steps to protect that. And there are some very basic ones to take. Use good PGP encryption. If you want to anonymize your web browsing, use Tor, the onion router. You can use Tails as a secure computer setup. And just, be aware that if you're involved in activism, don't organise stuff on social media because it's the spy's wet dream.
You're just giving it to them, aren't you? You're just telling them exactly where you're going to be.
Exactly.
Annie, I tell you what, it's a tonic. It is a tonic to have you back on. Love having you on my shows over the years. I think we've been speaking about 5 years on different avenues. Do get onto Annie's website, as she mentioned, anniemachon.ch, and I'm guessing those encryption tips you just gave there, some of that information might be on your website, maybe.
Very much so. I think there's something along the top bar which says privacy and, the issues and why I take my privacy and also my readers' privacy very seriously. This is a custom-built website. No cookies, no nothing. You can read it in privacy and not worry about being tracked. So it's very important, and also some steps to take to protect yourself. And it's been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, Richie, so thank you very much.
You won't hear it now, but I'm going to play out with Carly Simon and Nobody Does It Better. Because it's a bit cheesy, but I couldn't care less. It's totally appropriate. Annie, look after yourself. Keep doing what you're doing because you're helping raise awareness of these things for many, many, many people. And I hope in the new year we'll have you back on. It's a bit early to be wishing people Merry Christmas, but have a good Christmas. Look after yourself, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much.
Richie Allen.